Yeah, wasn't it a good interview? I'm glad we did that. Thank you so much for your time. Okay, folks, you know me. This is Taimur Rahman, and I am sitting with an incredible activist. Her name is Claudia de la Cruz, and she spans 2 continents, in my view. Perhaps we could even say she spans 3 different continents. If I'm not mistaken, your parents were Spanish.
Well, they're Caribbean, from the Dominican Republic, yeah.
Right, thank you, from the Dominican Republic, but you are based in the United States of America.
I'm based in New York.
And you have been an activist as far as class, race, and gender is concerned.
Yeah.
From a left-wing perspective, from a Marxist perspective. And we are here to talk to Claudia today about Black Marxism, which I think is quite interesting. By the way, because Claudia spans several continents, she speaks 3 different languages.
Nice.
Fluent English, as you can see, fluent Spanish, and fluent Portuguese. It's incredible. I'm really happy, Claudia, to have met you here in Nepal and met you earlier as well. And I'm looking forward to a great discussion on understanding how race, class, and gender intersect in the context of the United States and the Caribbean.
Well, thank you for having me and for asking me to be in conversation with you about these topics.
Great. So let's start right off. What is Black Marxism? Is there such a thing?
That's a great question.
Okay. You're not expecting me to answer it, are you?
No, I think it's important. I like to go to Walter Rodney when I'm asked that question, because I think he was able to articulate what Marxism is in a very manageable way. He spoke about scientific socialism, and he spoke about Marxism as a tool of analysis, but also as a tool to transform society. Now, if we understand Marxism to be that, we also understand that it transcends time, location, context, and it actually can be contextualized. Jose Carlos Mariátegui from Peru, who was also a Marxist, he was actually the founder of the Communist Party of Peru, understood that Marxism is not a copy and paste, that it needs to be contextualized. And therefore, the tool of Marxism could be utilized in that process. And so when we talk about Black Marxism, you're kind of inherently saying that Marxism itself doesn't speak to Black people, and therefore you have to remix it.
Interesting. But you feel it doesn't necessarily have to be remixed?
It doesn't, again, if we think about it as a tool, and we think about the fact that as a tool of analysis, and as a tool to transform society, understand society, engage with society, if we understand it as such, then we remix it not necessarily on the basis of identity.
Okay.
Right?
So there can't be a Muslim Marxism or a Black Marxism or a white Marxism or a...
Because what does that do then to the class struggle, which is also the foundation of Marxism?
What does it do to the class struggle?
Fragmentation.
I see.
Fragmentation. I mean, I think in a lot of ways, even when we think about, you asked before about Cedric Robinson, and he wrote about Black Marxism. What happens in the context of identity politics, which we could get into a little bit later, but what happens in the context of identity politics is then that you create a Marxism for all historically marginalized communities, right? And so my Marxism, as a Black Marxism, is not connected to your white Marxism, is not connected to your indigenous Marxism, is because we're so different. And so our Marxism is marked by our differences, not by our
commonalities.
Common identity, which is class. Is there such a thing as class reductionism? Yes, there is. You know, and we've made mistakes as a left, we've made mistakes as Marxists, but we have examples of people who have struggled within organizations to be able to mend some of what those mistakes have been historically.
All right, let me play devil's advocate, although largely I do agree with you. But my job here is not
to play devil's advocate.
Yeah, absolutely. Otherwise, how would I get the conversation going? So I recently read Cedric Johnston.
Cedric
Johnson.
Yeah.
Sorry, my mistake. Well, there were a number of arguments in that book which are quite interesting. And I'd like to tease them out with you and see what you think about them, and also help us to contextualize how they were used or deployed or in the struggle in the United States. So the first thing is that, of course, any question about with respect to race, especially not just in the United States of America, but across the American continent, is deeply tied to slavery. Mm-hmm. Now, Johnson makes the argument that if you look at European civilization, they've always had slavery. They've made Eastern European slaves, they've made the Irish slaves, they've made the Scottish and the Welsh, and etc., etc. There's been slavery sort of embedded throughout Western civilization. And hence his view is that it's not slavery that created racism, but rather that Europe always had a racialized thought process, which they applied to their own European people as well. And so this was just the extension of that same racism. So in a certain sense what he's saying is it's not that slavery created racism, it's that they were already racist, and that's what created slavery.
I think it's very, it's a provocation.
Okay.
Right? And this is why. Because it's ahistorical.
Okay.
And if you don't know history, it's easy for you to see that as a reality.
Okay.
Because there is such a thing as racism.
Yes.
That's real.
Yes.
Even though race is socially constructed.
Fair enough.
Right?
Yes.
And it's socially constructed because there was a need to create the other. To be able to justify slavery.
Before you proceed, let's just clarify to our viewers here what you mean that race is socially constructed. Could you walk us through that a little bit?
Oh, yeah. I will. But let's start with the point of slavery, because I think that
fine.
I think that
it'll develop into.
Yeah, I think it's important to understand that there is such a thing as ancient slavery.
Fair enough.
Which is not the same thing as chattel slavery.
Okay.
And ancient slavery preceded capitalism.
Fair enough. We have the Greeks and the Romans and the Arabs and
preceded feudalism. And even in African territory, there were slaves.
Fair enough, yes.
There were monarchies.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And so the concept of slavery in ancient times was not solely something that was attached to whiteness.
I see. So you could be a white person or a black person, you could be a slave?
Well, no, what I'm saying is that you could be owned as a person.
Right.
A black person could own another black person.
Fair enough. I even read, in fact, that the Berber tribes in northern Africa would take Italians as slaves. And the Arabs, of course, took many Caucasian, Armenian Christians as slaves, etc. And
then there is the development of feudalism as a society, right? And feudalism continues to exist in different forms still, right? But there is also a process of transference of society between feudalism and what capitalism, as we've come to know it now, which has developed over the years. There's a period that's called primitive accumulation, which is where chattel slavery develops.
What is that primitive? What do you mean? What is primitive accumulation?
When we talk about primitive accumulation, we're talking about the process by which the capitalist class was developed. Because the origins of slavery is precisely class society. Okay. Right? And again, in ancient slavery, even if we know that there weren't workers and the proletariat, because it wasn't during the industrialized world, there was a class society. There was a ranking of hierarchies. And so we're talking about that. In a class society, there is an othering that happens. And the other becomes subhuman. And that justifies the exploitation. We have to talk about the role of the church in that process as well.
What was that?
Well, it justified that, you know.
And it profited off.
And it profited off. I mean, it was the biggest, continues to be the biggest landlord, right? And so, private property, like human beings become private property in that process. The difference, I think, between ancient slavery and the slavery that happened within primitive accumulation is that it became an industry. I
see. It came on an industrial scale.
It became an industrial scale. And so, you know, the cotton pickers in the South, people who were kidnapped from Africa. And again, I have to talk about Walter Rodney, because Walter Rodney spoke about the underdevelopment of Africa and how Europe underdeveloped it, not only by taking, you know, the human beings out of Africa, but also taking the creativity, taking people at their prime time, where they could have developed so many things in their continent, and we're unable to because they were stolen. The Middle Passage, so millions and millions of people died and didn't make it to the Americas, right? And so when we talk,
and there were millions who perished even before that in the capture.
Yeah, the capture. Yeah, and so it's important to think about the profiting that happened. So you have the plantations in the south part of the Americas, like the American South, that were basically building the cities in Europe.
Yes.
In France.
Absolutely.
Right? They were building it up. But as that slavery, that overexploitation is happening in the south of the Americas, you could see overexploitation happening in the factories.
I see. Of Europe.
Of
Lancashire. I see.
And then even
you had children and women working in horrible conditions.
And there was even a moment of solidarity between those workers and the enslaved.
Oh, you mean during the African?
Yeah.
During the Civil War. Yes.
When in England people in the factory said, we're not going to produce.
Yes,
we're not going to produce
clothes.
They went on strike. We're not going to produce clothes. And so when we miss that part, we miss that there is a possibility for multinational solidarity. So when we talk about Black Marxism, we erase that story.
Interesting.
And to just progress into the question of race and this othering piece, right? In order for you to create a system of overexploitation, you need to justify it. The United States continues to do that today. You need to justify it. And in order for you to justify it, you make up things.
Stories.
You make up stories, and then you start kind of like studying genetics and justifying how people are built differently biologically and how they have a smaller brain than yours and how you were divinely ordained to enslave these people and how it's justified by the church. The church tells you will get to heaven and heaven will be better and you obey your master. And so there's a whole infrastructure that's created.
Sure.
But it's created on a basis that is the economic base.
All right.
To be able to maintain it and reproduce it. So when we talk about race as a social construction, is that justification for what then becomes racism. You could be a racist, because if you're a racist, you're in your divine right to be a racist because that other person is subhuman.
When you talk about the construction of a race, and then the construction of racism around that concept of a race, do you mean by that given that in fact the Africans that were taken from Africa belonged to so many diverse languages, ethnicities, groups, etc., and they were homogenized?
That's true.
Is that what you mean?
That's part of it.
Okay.
That's part of it. But I think the folks in Africa that were stolen became Black.
I see. That's the common identity that they acquired.
Exactly. They became Black. And then Black meant slave.
Yes.
In 1622, which is a couple hundred years after, a couple hundred years after, in Virginia, there was a law that was passed.
What was that?
And the law that was passed was that any Black woman who birthed a child, right?
With a white person?
No, that birthed a child,
right.
a Black woman birthing a Black child,
right.
That Black child became the property of the slave owner.
Wow. That's unfathomable.
So as a woman...
So you're born into slavery?
You're born into slavery.
My God. You're owned from the womb.
From the womb. They would breed human beings, right? And so the brutality of slavery, if we don't understand the economic base of that, then we don't understand capitalism, because colonialism, slavery are the down payments for what capitalism and imperialism are today.
I see. Very interesting. Again, to not to flog a dead horse, but just to take the argument a little further.
Yeah.
So Cedric Johnson says that when Africans were taken from the continent and brought to the American continent, it was not just as human cargo that they were transported from one continent to the other. But at the same time, their culture, their language, their sense of not essentializing whatever, not meaning to essentialize all the diversity of Africa, but whatever their culture was, they brought it with them. They brought music with them, they brought their sensibilities with them, their aesthetic sense with them, etc. And his argument then is that the early revolts against slavery were not just like Marxism was in a certain sense a criticism of Western civilization, whereas the early revolts against slavery were a rejection, he says, of Western civilization, altogether rejection of Western civilization. And what they wanted to recreate was they wanted to move away from that civilization and recreate an African cultural identity, and that Marxism never got that about the way in which this entire thing was happening. Do you agree? Do you see where I'm going with this? Do you agree with this?
I see where you're going with it. I mean, I think that again obscures a lot.
Okay.
I think yes, it is true. I mean, as immigrants even, which is very different than being stolen from your homeland, although there is such a thing as forced migration. My parents forcefully migrated to the United States because of the conditions that imperialism created in our country. Right? So.
And millions of people.
And millions of people do, and are forced to leave their hometown. When you leave, you don't leave you don't live in a vacuum, and you don't come empty-handed.
Yeah.
You come with everything you are and everything that your culture is. And so, while that is true, we could look at Haiti, for example, in 1804. Their concept of, and their understanding and their need to be able to free themselves. Okay, because I think CLR James does a really good job in the Black Jacobins to actually put the Haitian Revolution in the context of working class revolutionary processes.
Sure.
Right? Understanding that Haitians were also influenced by Europe.
Yes.
Their concept of democracy, their concept of freedom, and the hypocrisy that existed between a colony, right, that a colony that was being exploited, material was extracted, indigenous people were being killed, enslaved people were being, all of this is happening while the colonizers talking about freedom, democracy, and fighting their own processes in their homeland. And so, but the process of revolution did play a very big part to Saint Louverture. Folks were also reading the pamphlets that were being transported. They were engaging and organizing precisely because they felt that spark, that revolutionary spark, and understood that they needed to fight for what freedom meant to them as a Black nation.
So in a certain sense, they were more faithful to the principles of the French Revolution than the French Revolution was.
Exactly. And so I think it's important to understand context. The Haitian Revolution didn't just happen because they woke up one day.
Fair enough.
Folks were experiencing a material condition of overexploitation, and at the same time there were ideas that were being brought in. There were talks. Things are happening in the world. And so how is it that we can't do it? And they did it. And it was the first Black revolution.
Yeah. Anti-slavery.
Successful.
Yeah.
And Haiti has had to pay the price ever since.
It's fair to say that, yeah. Absolutely.
But I think it's important to again contextualize it. Even in the process of building that revolution, there were soldiers that were Polish, that came from other parts of Europe, that defected from the French militaries.
Oh, that's yeah.
CLR James speaks about Blackness as a politic.
Not necessarily as a race, but as a politic.
As a politic.
Explain that to me. What
Why?
Does that mean?
Because Haiti, in winning their revolution, also gave citizenship to those who fought to gain the Haitian Revolution. And amongst those people who fought, there were white people who fought.
I see.
And again, and I'm not
so
trying
it
to
became a political
yeah,
question.
and I'm not trying to be like, you know, kumbaya, we're all cool. You know what I'm saying? Because there's real, again, racism is real, white supremacy is real. But these are constructions of the enemy.
Right. And we have to overcome those constructions, not fall prey to them, is what you're saying.
Exactly. And I think that there have been examples in history of people who have done it, or who have tried to do it. Like, if you take, for example, the CPUSA, the Communist Party of the United States, you know, we had amazing, and I say we because it's part of the lineage, it's part of the tradition. We had Claudia Jones, you know, she's Trinidad and Tobago, an immigrant. She was persecuted during the McCarthyism era. This woman spoke about the black belt theory and the importance of organizing in the South, but she also spoke to intersectionality, the question of race, gender, class, and how the party, first and above all, how her party needed to struggle with contradictions internally.
I see.
You know, Paul Robeson is another one. You know, and there's so many. We could go down the list of black folks that assume a Marxist identity, who assume the task of building a communist society, who were engaged with the USSR, who were engaged with China. W.E.B. Du Bois, his wife, died in China.
Is that right?
Yeah, she's buried in China.
Really?
Yeah.
Did not know that.
Yeah, and so, you know, these were connections that were built because there was an understanding that black liberation, women's liberation, and socialism
are connected
and are essential for the liberation of all people.
So many questions are coming in my mind, but we'll have to go through them one by one.
Okay.
Because it seems to me that, well, let me start with what you started about the Communist Party CPUSA. When I first became familiar with radical black politics in the United States, I was a student then, and I knew a little bit about it even before, but I learned more about it as a student there. I somehow had the wrong impression till much later that all of that began in the late 1960s, or with the Black Panther Party and other things like that. And then to my surprise, I discovered that actually there was a deep, long history of activism going all the way back, of the CPUSA organizing in what's called the Deep South, and, you know, bringing people up. Can you speak a little bit about that?
I mean, you know, it goes way back. I mean, I think even we think about Frederick Douglass, who was a former slave, you know, and I'm talking about 1848. And he was talking about, you know, the Haitian Revolution. He was talking about internationalism. Because I think, you know, even if folks haven't or don't claim certain things, the principles and the values could be tied to the lineage. You know, and Frederick Douglass was one that spoke to internationalism, that spoke to working class, that spoke to the need of being able to organize black folk. But within this Pan-Africanist, he didn't say that, but within a Pan-Africanist perspective. And so the lineage comes from him, and I'm sure many others that we don't know in history, who are part of movements. There's every moment of exploitation brings resistance. And so in history, I'm sure that there were many others who we could call on. You know, there's Nat Turner, there is Harriet Tubman. These were folks that in their context and from the experiences they know and from the knowledge that they had, we're able to think about liberation and black liberation and what that meant. And so when we're talking about the CPUSA, we're talking about that lineage as well. And we're talking about, you know, folks who understood the need to organize the South. I mentioned the black belt theory, which is the understanding, you know, that as goes the South, goes the country. The South was basically the economic foundation, not only of the north of the United States, but Europe, Europe as well, you know, because that's where the plantations were. And so the organizing of folks that were once slaves and then became sharecroppers, and now, you know, they were free, but they had to sell their labor, and they also didn't have a lot of the civil rights, human rights that other folks were granted centuries before. For the CPUSA, it was a primary task. And so when we're talking about the South, one very important case was the Scottsboro Boys, which was a group of boys that were charged with, you know, sexually harassing and raping a white woman. And it was a group of 6 young men. And there was a huge international campaign that was created around that. And the CPUSA was at the forefront of that.
What year was that?
We're talking about the 1930s, 1940s.
So a period when there wasn't much sympathy for
black folks. We're talking about Jim Crow South, you know, segregation. There were still lynchings happening, you know. And so I think it's important to acknowledge, actually it was like the late 1920s.
I see.
Because it was before the Great Depression.
Very interesting. How do black people in the United States, African American people in the United States, view the Civil War, Lincoln's role, and the idea or what was expected, the soldiers that fought against the southern states, against slavery, etc. What they were expecting, that they would not only be set free, but they would have land, that they would be able to till themselves. Talk about that a little bit, because, I mean, well, I want you to talk about it. I won't say anything further. How do people view that today?
I think it's important to say that, unfortunately, a lot of our history is not something that's easily granted to us or easily available. And there's certain parts of history that are placed into the curriculum because it benefits the ruling class for us.
Sounds like Pakistan, folks.
Right? So like the U.S. Civil War is something that we kind of scan through.
I see. Although it's so central in my view to understanding what happened and, you know, where... what happened with slavery, what happened with the promise for freedom. You
know who does that really well? W.B. Du Bois in Black Reconstruction.
Yes, of course.
He does it really well, but it's not a text that we read in school.
Really?
No, unfortunately.
What do you read in school then?
I mean, you learn about President Lincoln, Emancipation Proclamation, and how great he was because he freed the slaves.
That's it.
And that's all you learn.
So you don't learn further that all the same slaves had to go back and work for the same planters as wage laborers.
No, exactly. No, you don't learn that. And you don't learn also about the role of the North. You know,
in what sense?
The role of the North of the United States in terms of finance capital that was also benefiting from slavery. You know, and even though we try to say, well, the North, that's where, you know, people went and they were free, and people, and actually, yes, a lot of people they did, right?
The
Underground Railway, and people did find freedom in some ways, but finance capital was very much connected to slave owners in the South, and so we don't speak about the betrayal, you know, and the promises that were broken.
Although, I mean, they may not speak about it in schools, but I felt at least, or I feel at least, that is something that people do feel, that black people feel.
Oh yeah. And that's why,
even if they're not taught it, they know it.
No, and they know it. And I mean, know it, feel it.
They live it.
They live it. I mean, we talk about reparations, right? And in this context, what would reparations look like? It definitely not look like 40 acres and a mule, you know, like which was what was promised.
Of course, society has changed.
Yeah, society has changed entirely.
Oh, sorry, did you say that was promised?
That was promised.
Really?
40 acres and a mule.
I see. I didn't even know that.
40 acres and a mule.
I see.
Yeah. And it's also because, again, we're talking about folks that were coming out of or were to come out of slavery, and you needed to live, and so you needed a plot of land to work on it, and so that promise was that you would gain you would have it, and that was not what happened. You know, the Black Reconstruction period, which is a very short-lived period, allowed for a lot of progress in terms of like there were actually folks who were able to gain a certain type of position in society that Black people wouldn't have gained otherwise. So, for example, like electoral positions or folks being able to go into certain industries of work and stuff like that. But that was a very small minority, and it was very short-lived as well.
Of course. The poor are still disproportionately Black across the United States.
Yeah.
Tell me something. I mean, since you're also from the Caribbean, and you know Haiti has such a phenomenal history of revolt, but so many other Caribbean countries too as well. In fact, there was an entire period when the whole of the Caribbean was just sort of up in arms and in revolt, etc. I was reading Eric Williams, who went on to later become the president of Trinidad, etc. But is that, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, he's still highly and well respected in the Caribbean, but doesn't have the same kind of influence in the North American, African American movement. Am I right?
Yeah. I mean, I think, again, it has to do with in the United States, there's been a very intentional rupture of transfers of knowledge.
I see.
And when folks attempt to look for that knowledge, we can easily find the person, the leader, but we don't find the political connection to the leader.
Interesting.
Right? So, for example, people know about Martin Luther King.
Sure.
A lot of people don't know that he was a socialist.
They don't know his politics.
No, he was a socialist, and at the end of his life, he was advocating for the overthrowing of capitalism. Like that's what he was doing, you know. And so
even I was surprised to discover that.
And when people talk about Martin Luther King, and a lot of he was a pacifist, and he's been whitewashed, and so the back end.
Is that a pun?
Whitewashed. and so the back end, what his politics were, are ripped away. That
there was a wonderful campaign. What was it called? The Poor People's Campaign.
The Poor People's Campaign.
Tell me about it.
Well, the Poor People's Campaign attempts, because it continues to be there, to revitalize and place into this context what his Martin Luther King's last campaign was, which was the Poor People's Campaign of 1968, which was the year he was killed. He actually was killed a couple of months before the campaign was actually launched.
I see.
And it was a campaign that was able to bring, a diverse group of people together on the basis of three things: the evil of militarism.
I see. Which was the big question.
The big question.
Still remains.
Yeah, the big question, the war in Vietnam. Yeah. The economic injustice, which was the question of capitalism. And then the third piece that he talked about was racism.
Of course, naturally.
So those were the three things. And in this new Poor People's Campaign, they added two points more, which is environmentalism and ecological destruction.
Okay. That's weird if it's dying.
Yeah,
that's incredible.
No, but this is now. So these 2 points.
Oh, they added it now.
Yeah,
okay.
So that they added the ecological devastation, and they added moral values.
I see.
Yeah.
I see. I mean, if you think about the Poor People's Campaign, it's really joining the race question with the class question, because poor people are disproportionately Black in the United States of America, but they're not just Black.
Yeah.
They could be, of Latin origin and white origin and all that, Indian and Pakistani origin.
Yeah. In fact, people don't usually make the connection. The vast majority still, in terms of population in the United States, is white. Black and brown people, and that includes Latinos, indigenous people, we are disproportionately poorer.
Yeah.
But there is a lot of poverty in white communities.
Of course there is, yes. And I worked for the Catholic Worker while I was in the US building homes, etc. And I was shocked to discover the level of homelessness, and that's even gone up now after 2008, etc.
Yeah, I mean, after the pandemic, you know, there in New York City, which is one of the most expensive cities, there was a report that came out in the New York Times that in December, only 65% of landlords were able to collect rent. Which means people can't pay rent, which means homelessness. Because we can't pay rent, you go into the street.
Yeah.
You know, and so
that's
horrible.
That destroys you.
Yeah. I mean, in New York City, you have over 11,000 children who are homeless.
On the street.
Yeah, who are homeless. You know, and homelessness constitutes, yes, those that are destitute in the street, but then there are also folks who are homeless who are living in shelters. Or who have home instability.
Yes.
Where they are kind of going from couch to couch.
Yeah. I understand that. So Claudia, I want to continue with that in just a bit, and especially talking about contemporary U.S. politics. But let's do that at the end.
Yeah.
I wanted to also raise a third concern that I saw with Cedric Johnson, what did your thoughts on that? Which is it's a kind of esoteric sort of idea, a bit sort of philosophical. But the idea that I read in that is that during the French Surrealist movement, the French Surrealists, who were themselves white folks, wanted to break the shackles of slavery of the mind, imaginative slavery as they called it.
Okay.
And they thought that all these ideas about scientific rationality and so on and so forth were just methods of control, etc. Very much predating Foucault and the postmodernist term, etc. But the interesting thing in that was that Cedric Johnson, etc., argue that that kind of mysticism was already part of African culture, legacy, and tradition, and aesthetic sense and thought process, and so on and so forth. And so that so a rejection of European scientific objectivity, historical materialism, would be part of the assertion of being African or being of African origin, let's say. And so that, I think, kind of in a certain way predates the postmodern turn away from objectivity to subjectivity. What are you feeling? I've said a lot of big words there. But basically, in sum, the idea is all this science stuff is basically all white man's stuff. And we were always very spiritual.
I mean, again, I'll go back to Walter Rodney.
Okay, nice, all right.
I mean, I think, you know, it's important to also contextualize Cedric. Okay. I think, you know, the question of the emergence of postmodernism and what it has done to society is to remain in the subjective.
Yes.
In the realm of, you know...
They own that.
Yeah. It's in the realm of, like, the emotions. It's in the realm of the spirit, which is very, very important. Yeah. And I think, you know, earlier I talked about, like I mentioned, some of the mistakes we've made as Marxists that I think we need to own, and it's kind of dismissing the emotions, dismissing the spirit, dismissing certain things or aspects of culture, and not engaging with it, because we are emotional beings, because we are, you know, we are spirit. Absolutely. You know, some of us might call it that, others folks might call it, but we are moved by feeling. Absolutely. And so what capitalism and postmodernism did so well was tap into that subjectivity, was tap into that emotion, was affirming it, you know, and saying, well, you know what, you are the experts of your reality, and your emotions are valid. And that's a half truth. Yeah. Right? Your emotions are valid, but your emotions can be wrong. Yes. Because
my emotions are frequently wrong.
And why? Why can your emotions be wrong? Because they may not be oriented by reality.
Yeah, when you think, sometimes when you're too emotional about something, you can mislead yourself. If you're too angry about something,
you can mislead yourself. You can misread the situation. You can, you know, be confused. Like, there's so many things that could go wrong. And so understanding that in our personal lives and in politics, helps us to pause a little bit and get a sense of what is really happening. What is factual here? And we can't say that facts are subjective. There's history.
Slavery is a fact.
It's a fact. It's not an emotion.
No.
It is connected to an economic system. That's a fact. That's not an emotion.
The 13 million people who were taken from the west coast of Africa is a fact.
It is a fact, right? And so when we're talking about, that's why I said race as a construct, the understanding that, you know, these people are black and these people are white and black is less and white is more, that construct was created. Racism is real. White supremacy is real. But we need to connect white supremacy and racism to its economic base.
To its roots.
What
is it all for?
What is it for and what does it serve?
What is it for?
Yeah. What?
I'm asking you.
Yeah.
It's because they wanted to, you know,
in the
slaves to work to death.
Yeah.
And benefit from their work.
That's definitely it. But they also wanted to justify, like I said earlier, right? The idea that black is less means that I could use and overuse and overexploit because they're not human.
Yeah.
They're property.
They're
not human. They're property. When we think about, you know, the development of policing in the United States, they were slave catchers.
Yes.
The police, what we know now as police, were then the slave catchers.
Wow. That was their primary job.
They were the ones that hunted down the slaves and brought them back or killed them. You know, and what does the what is the police doing now? The police in the United States doesn't protect and serve the people. They protect property.
There's a lot of police brutality that we've seen.
I mean, recently they just killed a 29-year-old man because he was driving with his tail light broken. And they killed him. They brutally murdered him. And so, again, we're talking about systems that are really connected and rooted in what capitalism is. And it serves capitalism. Race in the U.S. society has served to divide the working class.
And
subject. And now there's a weaponizing of emotions, right? Because this conversation that we're having it in different spaces in the United States, they would say, well, you're a class reductionist. You're not taking into consideration.
I get blamed for that a lot.
Yeah, you're not taking into consideration the experience of black people, even though I am black myself. I'm actually from a part of the Americas that received the enslaved people from Africa before they made it to the United States. I'm from the Dominican Republic. And so
in addition to being African American or Afro-Caribbean or however, or black, right? You're also sort of part of the third world.
Yeah, the global south.
The global south.
Yeah. And so I think, you know, it's important to put things into context, to be able to define things within a historical understanding, a material understanding of things. And I think, you know, when Cedric Johnson speaks to, like, you know, we have this, yes, we all have this thing. Like, it is true that within the Haitian Revolution, voodoo, which is very much an African practice, served a purpose. It did.
What purpose did it serve?
I mean, you know, I think when we talk about mystica in different spaces, right? And we do mystica, and that's basically the spirit of struggle. That's the coming together to be able to raise symbols, to be able to raise flags in our cases now, that affirm our struggle. And voodoo was that. It's a religious practice. It's a faith more than a religious. It's a faith. It's a faith practice.
That builds a certain community.
That builds community, that brings people together. And those spaces served for folks to communicate with each other in a way that enslavers, colonizers wouldn't understand.
Would never understand. And that allowed them also to come together to be able to fight.
Exactly. You know, and so, yes, of course, we have that mystica, we have that spirit, but to decontextualize it and put it as something that is like, it's like mythical, almost like this.
I also find it very strange, Claudia, when someone from the West, for example, says that, you know, all the Indians were always superstitious and religious and we were rational. Or they say all the Muslims are always, you know, they've never contributed anything to science and we are the scientists, etc. That's simply not historically correct.
Yeah, that's ahistorical.
It's completely ahistorical. So when someone, even within ourselves, says, "Oh, we're not scientific. We are very spiritual and mystical and metaphysical," and those people are scientists.
That's very paternalistic.
It's kind of it kind of actually historically just is not true.
Yeah.
I mean, the Egyptians, the Nubians, the Benin Kingdom, and so many, the Moroccans, the Berbers, etc. They contributed so much to the spread of knowledge, the creation of knowledge, and I'm sure there are many others that I'm not being able to mention because, I'm no expert on African history, but even a perfunctory understanding of that history would tell you what great contributions Africans
I mean, that's what Walter Rodney was talking about when he said, the slave trade didn't allow for the development of Africa, not only because there were just human beings taken. I mean, there was a potential of people being able to build, being able to use science, to be able to use their creativity. Yeah. And so I think, just saying we're people that are filled of spirit but not intellect is not correct.
It's not correct.
It's not correct. I think, one thing is to feel, but we are also rational
Absolutely.
beings. And we also have the capacity in our wisdom, which could be, ancestral wisdom to contribute in many ways. Like, then what are you talking about when you're talking about, midwives? Or you're talking about healers?
Absolutely.
These folks were scientists in their own right.
In their own way, absolutely.
In their own
a
right.
knowledge of nature, a knowledge of the trees and the shrubs and the mountains and the rivers and the waters, etc.
They were scientists in their own right, and so that's also an affirmation. That position is also an affirmation that intellect and intellectual production is owned by them, by those people. Like, we have something that is mythical.
Yes.
And that is not true.
Yeah, that's deeply sort of, in a certain sense, weird to say that.
That's weird, but that's also very paternalistic. It's also very, in some ways it shows internalized.
It's Orientalism.
Yeah.
It's what Edward Said referred to as
Orientalism. Yeah,
In a different context.
Yeah.
When he's talking about the Orient and we are here talking about Africa, but it's the same kind of thing.
The same kind of thing. And so I think, it's important to acknowledge the limitations of that analysis because it's very limited.
Yeah. So we've talked about W.E.B. Du Bois, and we've talked about Eric Williams, and we've spoken about Cedric Johnson and Martin Luther King. And there's one figure that we've not mentioned so far and spoken about, which is Malcolm X.
My favorite.
Yeah. Tell us about him and tell us how he impacted Black consciousness. His own consciousness underwent several transformations and developments and so on, from a young man to the Nation of Islam, and from there forward, etc. and so on. Tell us about it.
I mean, I think the story of Malcolm X shows a political, the progression of what political development looks like.
I see.
I think, if you look at where he comes from a family of a Caribbean mom. His mom was from Trinidad. His dad, his mom was from Martinique, I'm sorry. His dad was a Garvey. So they followed the understanding of Marcus Garvey. His dad was killed by white supremacists. His mom suffered from health conditions and was put in an asylum. But before then, if you hear the stories of his brothers and sisters and his own autobiography, you find that his mom was very influential in his politics from a very early age in terms of dignity, in terms of who you are. Don't let them tell you you're less. And a lot of the rebelliousness that we know of Malcolm X, when he was a kid, and got into trouble, and went to jail. A lot of that rebelliousness comes from that understanding that I am not less. And he was asserting himself in that belief in a context where there was segregation, where Jim Crow was still a reality, where you couldn't look at a white woman as a black man. And so he was living in a society that he was constantly clashing with, and obviously he lands up in jail And in jail, he becomes a member of the Nation of Islam. And he converts himself into the Muslim tradition. He studies a lot. He reads a lot. He follows the teachings of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. And in that context, he becomes a spokesperson for the NOI. And he speaks very, if you go on YouTube and you hear the speeches, he was an educator. He was an educator. He spoke, I think, from a very genuine point, from his experiences, having come from a working class background, having experienced racism, having experienced prison, and utilizing those experiences to organize in the Black community. Like the aspect of base building, of going into the streets and having street meetings and speaking to people. He would call that fishing. You need to go fishing. Yeah. And there was an understanding that the NOI needed to know Christianity really well, because Christianity was the language of the majority of Black folk. And so you needed to connect with the people. Even though you were from a Muslim, if you were going to recruit, you needed to know what to talk with people about. So these are like very essential organizing techniques that if you read enough about Malcolm X, you'll pick up. And Malcolm X, again, he then moves, there's some internal conflicts that happen with the Nation of Islam, political differences. He takes that very known trip to Mecca, and he finds that there are white Muslims, and then he comes back and he's like, well, wait a minute, maybe the question is not a question of only Blackness, it's also a question of economics. And he starts questioning the economics of this country. And a lot of people, I remember I went to seminary because I'm a theologian as well.
Wow.
And I remember,
I'm gonna be careful.
Yeah. I you gotta speak the languages of people. That's part of it. So I remember being in a class and folks kind of like trying to put Malcolm X and Martin Luther King against each other. And they had different tactics.
Sure.
But their overall strategy was the same, right?
And the ends were the same.
The ends were the same. The
elimination of racism.
The elimination of racism, and also the uprooting of capitalism towards the end of their life.
They were all gravitating.
They were gravitating to the same point, and we see that when Martin Luther King is in jail, he's imprisoned in Binghamton, and Malcolm X is invited by Coretta Scott King, who was Martin Luther King's wife. He's invited to do a speech in one of the rallies. And in his speech, he says, if you don't want to deal with that peaceful Negro in jail, you're going to have to deal with me. And so he's out here advocating for the release of Martin Luther King, which shows you that they're not opposing forces, that they both are walking the same path, maybe not together, but definitely, parallel to each other.
Absolutely parallel to it, no doubt about that. You know what I really sort of, when I see Malcolm X, speeches and so on, and I listen to him speak, what strikes out the most to me is the way his confidence.
Oh, yeah.
We have an expression in Pakistan, I don't know if it applies here, but he was looking his opponents in the eye.
Oh yeah.
And he taught. I'm sorry if I'm taking your place, but in a certain sense, he taught Black America to look, look at their opponents in the eye and respond to them, which is a sign of dignity. That I am equal to you. You may have oppressed me, but I don't accept that oppression.
He had backbone. This man was not bending, bending, and I think wherever Malcolm went, and whomever he had contacts with, he went to universities, and his mosque was in Harlem, because Harlem was very key.
That's where he hosted Fidel and so on, and the Cubans.
That's right. And his position was, we are human, we're people, we're Black, and we gotta be proud. And this sense of Black pride that then the Black Panther Party, because then SNCC, the students movement, all these different groups came out of that tradition of like, wait a minute,
Yeah.
we are human. Like we are human, and we need to carry ourselves
and we're proud of who we
with
are.
that pride, with that dignity. You know, the slogan "Black is beautiful." All of that came out of Malcolm's ability to walk with his walk straight.
Yeah,
you
and
know?
look in the eye.
Exactly, and be fearless.
Yeah.
This man was fearless.
He was.
You know,
He
and
was.
so I think to think about Malcolm X is to think about the birth of a revolutionary process that was short-lived as well. When you think about the Black Panther Party, you know, and the counterinsurgency.
The FBI crushed
Yeah,
that.
the counterinsurgency that was created through COINTELPRO, which was the FBI's project to infiltrate,
And
destroy. You know, but the Black Panther Party was, you know, Malcolm X was it.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. We have spoken. Wow, this is an amazing conversation. I have to say, Claudia. I mean, it's a whole world on its own to explore, and there's so many different aspects that you've touched upon that we may or may not be able to cover. I do think that it would be an injustice not to mention Fred Hampton and the Black Panthers.
Fred Hampton. So, you know, I mean, Fred Hampton is another figure. He was only 19 years old when he became the chairman of the Illinois chapter.
Unbelievable. Yeah.
Of the Black Panther Party.
Yeah.
And, you know, one of the things that he was very, very keen on was the development of Black consciousness. I mean, of class consciousness. Within the Black community.
Right.
Class consciousness within the Black community. And also creating what is, for us, understood as the historical Rainbow Coalition. Because there was another Rainbow Coalition that happened that Jesse Jackson was a part of. That's not what I'm talking about.
Okay.
I'm talking about the original.
What is that?
Rainbow Coalition. Well, he used this analogy, which I like very much. He used to say, if we're all in a burning house, we're not going to sit here and discuss our differences.
Nice.
We need to get out of the burning house.
Yeah, we need to find a way out of this mess.
And so one of the things that the Black Panther Party did under his leadership was talk to the Young Patriots, which were the white organization.
I see.
Talk to the Chicanos.
I see.
The Brown Berets.
I see.
Talk to the Young Lords, which were mostly on the West Coast, Puerto Rican, Cuban, and unify all these different groupings.
Oh, I can see how that must have upset the FBI.
Yes. Under the identity of class.
Right. Do you think that it's been sort of the strategy of those who do not want to see change to continue that bifurcation, to not allow these movements to come together?
Of course. I mean, now we have, you know, identity politics is really big.
And is that what it is?
And I would like to kind of like share some of where identity politics come from, which is completely different to what we know and understand.
Okay.
So identity politics was coined by a woman named Barbara Smith.
Right.
And Barbara Smith was part of a collective of Black feminists called the Combahee River Collective.
Oh, yes.
And the Combahee River Collective existed in the 1970s. In fact, it existed in the moment where the second wave of feminism was kind of being struggled.
Sure.
And so it was a response to white feminism.
Right.
But she was really clear. We're talking about a politic that speaks to our identity as Black women, as Black working women, as Black lesbian women, that is not detached from a politic of socialism and a politic of Black liberation.
Okay.
Because it was in the context of Black liberation movements.
Absolutely. Yeah.
National liberation struggles in Africa.
Yes.
You know,
yes.
that this concept,
and in the Caribbean.
yeah, and in the Caribbean, that this concept of identity politics came. What happens with identity politics now is that it detaches the politic that is a radical politic, that is a revolutionary politic, and it leaves it as a cultural identity.
Okay.
And so,
That's very interesting.
now you have, you know, a group of folks that are talking about LGBTQ rights.
Right.
You have a group of folks that are talking about, you know, Black struggles, which incarceration, policing.
Right.
And you have a group of people that are talking about women's rights. And so you have all these fragmentations that are based on identity. But at the end of the day, the philanthropy world and the nonprofit world are funneling money into these different groups.
I see.
That are ultimately being funded by the Democratic Party of the United States.
Right, and they own that sort of rhetoric. I mean, they may not own the money stream,
yeah.
but they are associated with this woke sort of
woke society.
Yeah.
And so now you have in the United States the narratives of like representation and diversity,
right.
Like people fighting to have a seat at the table, not to burn the house down, but to have a seat at the table with capitalists.
Right.
And what I've learned in my short-lived experience with Marxism is that you don't negotiate with your terrorists.
Yeah.
You know, you're trying to gain a seat at the table with the people who have exploited you, incarcerated your people, enslaved you, killed you, and you know, cold in the street. The people like these are the people that you want to sit with, and they come in all colors. Because there are black capitalists, there are white capitalists, there are Asian capitalists.
Because as you said earlier, you know, black politics is not about necessarily about it's a politics.
It's a politics.
It's a politics.
It's a politics, and you know, and
so you could have someone who's black, but he doesn't agree with that politics, right?
Obama.
Yeah. Okay.
Let's talk about.
I was thinking of Thomas Sowell, but okay.
No, Barack Obama.
Right.
I mean, the Vice President of the United States currently, Kamala Harris, she is single-handedly responsible for the incarceration of millions of young black men.
I read that.
And she is black.
And she's very hardcore on this, that we want to have stricter laws and, you know, throw more people behind bars.
I mean, Barack Obama, he has African descent. This man was the one to occupy militarily Africa. You know, like
it is difficult to process that.
The largest numbers of deportations happened under the Obama administration.
Yeah, I read that somewhere as well.
You know, the cages that then Trump uses were built by Obama. And so I think, you know, this concept of like, you know, all black is kin, all black is like, we're brothers and sisters, that is...
It's not necessarily true.
No, that is BS. It's bad sociology.
No. So Claudia, we have spoken in a lot of detail, and I'm really, as I said, there's a whole universe that I would like to learn about. But we've spoken about race, we've spoken about class, the connection between the two, etc. But there's one aspect which we've left, which is gender. How does that? And we've heard a lot about intersectionality and so on. But how does that work out? How do you? We've also spoken about identity politics a little bit. How are these things now connected? Capitalism, patriarchy, and racism, are they connected?
Of
and
course.
if so, how?
Of course. I mean, you know, I think it's important to go as back in history as we know it. There was a moment in society, and Sylvia Federici speaks a lot about this. There was a moment in society where there were roles that were not designated by gender, but more so in terms of like contributions. And women had a role that was productive in society. And there then comes capitalism and creates gender-based roles in society, where the function of women as caregivers, the function of women as tending to domestic work was not valuable. And men became more valuable in society because they were able to produce for capitalism. And I think it's important for us to understand that, because we talk a lot about reproductive work as well when we're talking or trying to, reclaim the value of the work that goes into caring for family and caring for people and the emotional labor and all these different things, which is work. And it's not less work than any other work.
That's a lot of work.
It's a lot of work, you know. And in society, women have multiple tasks.
Yes, they do. The dual and labor. And
so it's domestic work and it's emotional work and it's care work, and then there's work to produce.
Yes.
Right, to produce wealth,
commodities,
yeah. Right? And so, but understanding that there is that break in society. There is that moment in society. There is that shift in society. A lot of the revolts that were happening in Europe, specifically around, food shortages, that again came out of the processes of enclosure, of people not having access to the land that they once had, of being criminalized for picking wood because this no longer belongs to you. Those processes were very harsh on women. The witch hunts of women who were essentially midwives, who had a certain knowledge that they actually were able to share with their communities before, there was the invention of doctors.
Who had to be male. It was a kind of competition. They're like, we got to get into the competition. All the women healers have to go.
We got to and women who were organizers and revolutionaries as well, who were part of the revolts and were leading, all sorts of revolutionary processes against the development of this system that was robbing them. And so I think it's important to understand that. And again, the Sylvia Federici book, the Caliban and the Witch, is a really, really good book to understand that. And it's not a completely, again, because I'm not trying to sell Marxism. She defines herself as an anarcho-communist. But she really does bring forward.
But she could be a great historian.
Yeah, but she brings forth the history that is a history that we're not taught. And when you start learning that history, then you identify, wait a minute. Not all women are sisters either. Because you have the experiences of the bourgeois women, and then you have the experiences of working class women who have had to work all their lives.
And slaves.
Yeah, and slaves. You have had to work all your life to be able to live. Enslaved women, again, forceful overexploitation, and then when this supposedly transfers into freedom, you have to sell your labor. She speaks about how prostitution was legalized during a period, like it was legalized to be able to benefit capital and women's bodies and trafficking, like. So I think it's important to again understand the origins, to be able to understand that as women, and these women like Cruz and Kollontai and like all these different
Russian
revolutionaries are really good at talking about what is our interest as working class women, and that we've always had a place and we've always had a front place in society that capitalism has denied us of.
I see.
We've been there, but capitalism has erased us. And so the task of us, the task for women that are working class women, that are feminists, that are fighting patriarchal systems as a system that is, again, inherently connected to capitalism, is to build socialism.
Thank you, Claudia. That just about sums it all up. If I understood you correctly, and there's so much here to think about and try and understand, is that what the whole fuss is about exploitation, about people stolen from Africa, brought to America, to paraphrase Bob Marley, and exploited. Their bodies being exploited, their labor power being exploited, their minds being exploited, and then women in much the same way, and then poor white people who are working the farms like crazy, working in factories, and living and sleeping on the streets, even as children, as kids. So I guess what I'm saying is you want to see all the oppressed come together, stop arguing about the small differences between them, and realize that the house is on fire.
Yeah, that the house is on fire. And obviously, whoever exploits us can't exploit us all equally.
Yeah.
They need to find someone who is more exploited than the other, so that then we get into an Olympics on who is more exploited.
And oppression.
And oppression Olympics. Who is more oppressed than the other? And I think, it's important to acknowledge those differences.
Sure.
And it's important to fight internal contradictions, especially in organizations.
Sure.
We can walk together while we talk about these things, but when we stop, and that's the only thing we fight, then that becomes our struggle.
I see. And that
we
seems
stop
to
fighting
be,
the enemy.
Right. So that seems to be sort of the kind of cultural politics that we do see sometimes, which is it's not, it's never the capitalists who are the enemy.
Yeah.
It's someone else who's of a different identity from you.
It's the immigrant. It's the black. Is the black person? Is the white person?
Yeah.
Is the
male,
LGBTQ?
the female, the LGBTQ.
And so we're not walking and looking at the enemy.
Right.
We're looking at each other as enemies.
And that just kind of fractures and bifurcates.
And that has been a tactic of all oppressors, colonizers, divided and conquered.
Yeah.
And that's what capitalists do. And I think it's important for us to be able to understand that the modes of oppression have always been there. Their forms have changed. Their methodologies have changed. But they continue to be there. Slavery is not something of the past. It still happens now. The United States has the highest rates of incarceration. And the labor that comes from incarcerated people is disgusting.
Super exploitation.
It's super exploitation. And so slavery is not back there. Slavery is now. It's just changed. It's been sanitized. But it's the same thing.
Thank you, Claudia de la Cruz, for that incredible walk through history. You've seen it, folks. We covered African history, how Europe underdeveloped Africa, the development of the slave South, the rebellion against it, all the incredible figures that came out of that history, and the politics, in both the Caribbean and North America, even till today. Phenomenal. I just want to say that Claudia is part of the People's Forum, a representative from North America. And how can you be reached if women from Pakistan want to talk to you or send you an email? Or how?
Well, you can send.
How can they read you?
Yeah, they could send an email at Claudia@thepeoplesforum.org.
Perfect. And do you have a website, etc.?
Yeah, www.thepeoplesforum.org.
Perfect. Thank you so much, and I hope that we can continue this dialogue, and mainly because I want to educate myself, and I feel very privileged.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you everyone for tuning in.
Awesome.